MCB-10 was scheduled in 1965 to be the alert battalion that would go to Okinawa, where they would primarily do public work activities, primarily getting ready for that deployment. We went to Camp Pendleton for a week where we did military training. It was a chance for the men of 10 to be able to use their M16s as well as a variety of marine weapons, including some automatic weapons. We also were taken to the range where we threw hand grenades. Most of us got a chance to fire a bazooka. We saw demonstrations of machine gun fire at night, seeing the tracers. This was a particularly interesting range we were on with pop-up targets. You'd run down range. You had a Marine gunnery sergeant behind you for safety's sake. The target would pop up. You'd shoot at it until you hit it. It would drop. Then you would run to the next firing position and so on, all the time under close supervision with the gunnery sergeants. Here we had a chance to fire automatic weapons, which was quite a thrill, quite different from anything I had ever done. As well versed and trained as the Marines that took this training, but it was good training for us. No one really thought we would ever use any of it. In this situation here, we were on the range firing a bazooka, which was kind of fun. The projectile is a rocket, which you can actually see travel through the air. It would have been fun to have been able to fire a couple of times until you were able to actually hit the boxes on the far hillside. It was an interesting time for me being a dentist. I'd never had the opportunity to do most of these things, and as it turned out, it became some valuable experience. I had ROTC when I was in college, and so I knew how to field strip most of the weapons, which put me a step or two ahead of most of the other officers in the battalion who had been in engineering school, many of whom had not had ROTC, so they didn't have this experience. Here we see a thermite grenade being deployed. It was something that if you were going to have to leave equipment, you'd put a thermite grenade on the engine block of the truck or Jeep or whatever, and it would destroy it, render it useless. We were here seeing how to do a smoke screen with a smoke grenade. Probably also took care of some of the mosquitoes, although it was fairly cold, so that wasn't a big issue. The white phosphorus shell was rather beautiful, but also very deadly. Here we are with first dummy grenades, which are the same size and weight as a grenade, learning how to throw them when we're on our back or standing up in whatever situation. And in this case, up or the mine itself. We deployed on hillsides. The Seabees built fighting positions, camouflage, and then during it was a good training mission for our folks. None of us thought we'd ever actually be building such positions, but as it turned out, not too many months ahead of us, that's exactly what many of our people were doing. And then the Marines demonstrated some of their equipment for us that we had probably never seen before. We loaded up on 707 MATS airplanes and flew to Okinawa, where we spent an enjoyable 3 weeks. At the end of the 4th week, it became obvious that there was more going on than what we had ever dreamt. And so in late April of 1965, MCB-10 loaded up on 3 LSTs, 1166 there was the Washtenaw County, and on a landing ship dock, an LSD. And I can't remember exactly, but it was 6 or 7 days across the South Pacific to the beachhead at Chu Lai. There had been a hurricane come through sometime before, and we passed through the back of that. It was a very, very rough passage for most of us. Many of the folks became Seabees because they had a tendency toward motion sickness, and this certainly was not what they were looking forward to. As you can see, we got a lot of action, and many of the folks were pretty much under the weather from seasickness. It was a bit of mercy when we finally got into Vietnamese waters, which were much smoother, and for the first time we really got a view of the number of ships in our task force, which had grown considerably from the time we left Okinawa. Another of the LSTs. During this time we had some lessons, classes for our folks. I did some first aid classes. There were other discussions of personal safety, cleanliness that would be important. Gave them as much information as we had about where we were going and what we could expect. On the appointed day, there were cruise ACBs, which were amphibious CBs, who got in a mite boat and went to a meeting on one of the other ships in the task force. This was a fun-loving bunch of people who just thoroughly enjoyed themselves. When they came back after the meeting, suddenly they too were very serious, because the predictions were that there would be pretty heavy fighting crossing the beach, and so everybody got very serious about their business. I didn't enjoy these folks having to climb up this ladder. To me, that looks to be very challenging. The LSTs took some target practice. They used their big guns and did some firing. This was the closest I got to feeling like I was in the Navy. I'd first been stationed with the Marines at Camp Pendleton as a dentist, and then got to the CB Battalion and turned right around and went back to Camp Pendleton and flew to Okinawa, and at last ended up on a ship. Here we are offshore the day of the assault on the beach. You can see the landing craft in the distance. In the foreground there is an LST that had dropped the causeways. We'll drop ours here in a couple of minutes. We had 3 men standing by who would chop the ropes. As the ropes went, the causeways dropped into the water, and then the causeways that were already in the water, they came alongside, linked up to those. They had some phenomenally large outboard motors attached to the end of the causeways that then moved them into position on the beach. So here you see them being connected. Lots of fuel oil stored on the deck of our LST. And there is another section, one of our bulldozers that one of the artists in the battalion had painted a CB on, and you see the causeways there with the big outboard motors. Lots of helicopter activity. They were moving people ashore with the helicopters as well as the landing craft. There were a number of cargo ships off board. And here we see the first wave heading ashore. Earlier the beach had been bombed some, and the CBs, I'm sorry, not the CBs, the first wave of Marines there are ashore and heading inland. One of the major issues we faced up as a battalion was whether or not we would send our folks ashore with live ammunition. Yes, they had been trained at Camp Pendleton, but realistically that had been the only experience they'd had with their weapons. But in the end it was decided we really can't send somebody ashore on a hostile shore, so we dispensed ammunition that morning. And here the LSTs are finally tied up to the causeways, and we're beginning to unload our cargo of dump trucks, bulldozers, graders, steam shovels, and all the equipment that would be necessary for our camp. We were met by the crew that got ashore a little earlier. Welcome, MCB-10. These are recoilless rifles on these small tanks. They're pretty spectacular firepower. And a day later our LST leaves. Up to that point we could go back on board ship for a shower and a fresh meal. And now we're beginning to get a feeling of what our life is going to be like for the near future. When these helicopters took off, they blew sand all over us. We were living in tents on the sand. The dental clinic here was on the sand. There's the dental chair. In the background, our dental equipment. Our showers were outside, nice and warm. That wasn't an issue. It took a few days to get a shower. We did find some bungee stakes in our area. They were a bigger problem for the tires. You'd see them if you were walking around, but it would be pretty easy to drive over a truck. So here's the start of the airfield. The graders and the earth movers are out to flatten the sand dunes so that the Seabees can start constructing the runway. There's my dental assistant, Pacifico Guiyang, just shaking his head. How are we going to make a dental clinic out of this tent and sand? Literally within the first couple of days, the airfield was under construction. This particular day we rode in the ambulance down to the beach to the north of where we were, which was a Vietnamese fishing village. These small round boats women would take, and you would see them a mile or two offshore picking sea that went from Hanoi the whole way to Saigon. People had their homes dismantled and moved out to Highway 1, where after very few days homes began to appear again. But nonetheless, they were displaced out of the area where the airfield was going to be and where our base camp was going to be. They'd been getting water out of a shallow puddle that often has not had a water buffalo sitting in it. So the Seabees brought their earth moving equipment out and dug a real well so that the village had a better water supply. One of the chores that I was assigned since dentistry wasn't a big priority was photographic officer. And so about once a month we would go up with my photographers and get photographs of the area, including the airfield, that could be used for op reports that went back to PAC-CB, or the Seabees of the Pacific that were stationed in Hawaii. Here's a typical water source for one of these villages, and after the Seabees came in, they would dredge it out, get rid of the moss and scum, and oftentimes sandbag them so they had a better water supply. There were these monuments around. We're assuming they're tombs. We didn't know that. And here's another water source with a shovel digging a better well. This particular day the dirt was pretty hard packed, and it was not perking well. We weren't getting a lot of water in the well, so they took a couple of explosive charges and buried them in the side of the clay, and you'll see them go off here cracking the clay, which then did a much better job of filling. That particular day we found some tunnels. Unbeknownst to us, there were a whole series of tunnels that ran through the area. Never were much of an issue for us, but later on they probably were. So here's the explosion that went off to crack the earth and help make that a viable source of water for the village. In this village it was down more in the sand, so it was much easier to enlarge the pond to get a better supply. Kids and the adults typically wore these conical hats to protect themselves from the sun. It was common in the farmers. The fishermen wore a somewhat similar hat, but it was rounded on the top and came down over the sides a little more. Kids liked having their pictures taken, and we obliged them. So this is now along Highway 1. It's beginning to take a little better shape. The houses are beginning to be put back together. For a while we were having trouble with supplies, and so they airdropped some supplies to us. We would fire off this particular crop. It appears to be 7 or 8 shoots, and then one of the drops out popped, I'm guessing there were seals, who parachuted into the area. The joke was that way they could get their pay for having parachuted. There they come. All landed safely, all landed on the beach. Guess any landing you walk away from is a good one. Here's a bird dog that was reconnoitering the area. I like to get around to the job sites, and this particular day they were building a ditch for drainage along the runway, so I got to run the ditcher for a while. A little bigger cavity than what I was accustomed to doing. This is the mats padding, which comprised the taxiways and the runways. They were interlocking aluminum sheets, so they went together pretty fast. Each sheet weighed, as I remember, about 110 pounds. So these guys were in great shape from lugging and positioning those. And here we see a big section of our runway, and at long last it's ready for takeoff. The jets would take off with JATO, with some rockets. You'll see them fire in a second. You'll see me jump when they go off because it was very loud. There they fired, and finally you see the blue flame. And these fighter bombers would be then off in about 2,000 feet, and they'd come back and they'd land with the aid of arresting gear. So they'd come in and catch a wire to stop them. Here's another jet taking off. While these jets were taking off, the Seabees would be working on the runway ahead of where they would be flying over, until one day one of the bombs came loose and skipped over a grader. And at that point, when there were flight ops going, they would have the Seabees move out of the way for their own protection. Flight ops pretty much went around all day, occasionally at night, but much more so during the daytime. And one day, Robert McNamara arrived in his shiny C-123. There were quite a number of them on the field that day, lined up on the taxiways one after another. And in due time, we had helicopters bring McNamara and his crew that had been out inspecting the camps of the Marines. And the Hueys at that time were pretty new. We had not seen them. But that's McNamara in his khakis. No doubt doing statistics on the number of men that were there and the number of sorties that had been flown. And of course, once they were done inspecting, off they go. This is the beach to the north of where we were. Turned out it was a great place to snorkel and swim. We'd find langosta, which made our meals a bit more interesting than the standard C and K rations. Further north there was a river that went inland from our site. Eventually they built a docking facility in this area. At this time there were lots of fishing craft in the area. A very pretty area. Someday it's going to be a wonderful resort. I understand the runway that eventually was built. This was a tactical runway that was built to protect the area, and then they put a permanent runway in. Was taken over by the Vietnamese military when we left, and it has just been turned over to the civilians, so I suspect within a short time there will be hotels there. Looking down the muzzle of one of the recoilless rifles. Another inspection trip in the helicopter shows the progress on the airport and off in the distance Highway 1. But here is a runway that is about half done at this point. Here's our campsite on the beach. If you can't live in a hotel, a tent on the beach is the second best. And the causeway. This particular day there was a helicopter carrier offshore. Iwo Jima, if I remember right. I was on my way to Da Nang, and so got to take some pictures on the way. The chopper pilots would take off and climb very rapidly to get up, I'm guessing about 2,000 feet, where they would level off, and they'd fly at that until they got to where they were going. And the landings, not so much here at Da Nang, was a controlled crash. They would descend very rapidly, almost vertically, and then flare at the very last minute. The airfield in Da Nang was a very, very busy place, as you can tell here. Unfortunately, the video is a bit dark. But you can see the planes lined up. The helicopter area. In this particular case, I was sent to Da Nang. I can't remember, or from Da Nang to Saigon with a stop in Nha Trang. In Nha Trang we had a stat team that went to do schools, people-to-people stuff. And at the Nha Trang airport there was a battle running off in the hills, so they were picking up troops. These were Vietnamese troops, one flight after another. This was where our stat team lived. There were 10 CBs that lived in this building, a large home, at least large by Vietnamese standards, and that was their headquarters. We then went on to Saigon. This is looking across the Saigon River from the Majestic Hotel where we stayed a couple of days. There were shipyards. It was rather surreal. At night you could sit in the hotel having a beer and watch firefights take place across the river, but it was a very busy harbor. The traffic was atrocious. There were motorbikes, there were small cars. The general rule of thumb was if it was bigger than you, it had the right of way. A lot of bicycles had a little one-lung engine that drove the front wheel. It probably wouldn't pull you up a hill, but it made travel on the streets a lot faster. The jerkiness here has to do with the cab driver. They were real kamikazes. It was impossible to hold your camera steady. the American Embassy, which had been bombed before, so now they had these bollards in the sidewalk to prevent a car from driving into it. And villages and shops along the street, the palace and general shopping area. The park had these trenches cut in a zigzagging pattern so that if a mortar shell hit in the trench, it wouldn't kill everybody in the trench, just in the section where it lit. And there were various monuments. The rest of the park was very pretty. And the women wore the aodzai, which is a beautiful dress. But these parks were very, very nice. Sort of forget there was a war going on. On the way back, we saw more rivers, rice paddies, fields. The fish trap in the river north of our camp. So here we come back to Chu Lai. While I was gone, which was about 5 days, there was very definite progress made on the field. Here are some of the fighting positions the Seabees constructed, proving that the training they got at Camp Pendleton, in fact, was worthwhile. Camp now is being hardbacked. It meant we suddenly had plywood floors in our tents and 2x4s holding the tents up and mosquito netting, so that was a big improvement. We also got away from eating C rations, which were individual packets of meals, and we now had K rations, which meant we ate the same thing, but it was cooked by the cooks. This is a process of sterilizing your mess kit before the meal was put in it. It seemed to be every day it changed, but it was always the same. We'd had a small bear drop to us in one of our early supply drops, and we fed him cookies and candy and all the things he liked, and he got some infected teeth. So being the dentist, it was my job to take care of the bear. And here we see open drop ether. That's ether in the can, and it's been put on a gauze that we're holding over his nose to put him to sleep under general anesthesia. I had no idea how long it would last, whether he'd wake up or not, but he was infected and he was becoming a bit of a pest, because when his face would swell up, he'd tear it tense. So here you see me as a dentist taking teeth out. I had not taken that many teeth out of people, and I'd certainly never taken any teeth out of an animal, much less a bear. But they did come out, and he did survive, and he was a much happier bear when his face didn't swell up and become infected. My dental tech is on the right, Pacifico Guion. And you see the last little pieces of tooth coming out. Clean up the mess and hope that he wakes up. And in fact he did. Here he is the next day, being fed more cookies probably, but he liked them. He was a funny little bear. He'd run pigeon-toed, take him down on the beach, and he'd run with you, and he'd trip and fall and roll and come up. He wouldn't even slow down. Evidently in the wild these are rather vicious bears. This guy now is about as big as a big dog. He was a pretty friendly creature. We then began to pay a little bit more attention to the camp. There were evidence of Viet Cong up in the mountains, and we worried a bit about coming under a mortar attack, so they dug trenches, and then we filled sandbags, and it gave us a place that we could have some cover if in fact we did come under attack. It never happened. A couple of nights we thought we were under attack. The airfield was under attack, but we never took any live rounds in the camp. Nonetheless, it pays to be prepared. Not the favorite chore for the dental tech or the medical corpsman, for that matter. And a lot of work. The planes were lined up on the runway, and we had an evening when there were a lot of explosions. You can see here the camps along the beach, the runway's complete, the taxiway's complete, and you can see the airplanes sitting there. A group of Viet Cong came in and put some sort of explosive charges in the tailpipes, and they lost most of the airplanes on the field that night. They went up in a ball of fire. Here's our commanding officer, Commander Bannister, putting in the famous gold and silver finished screw for the airfield, which was quite an event. We had created a field that was over 10,000 feet long. It had taken about 3 months, and there had been combat missions being flown off of it by the 32nd. This particular day, there was a little inlet there that this sampan was in. They were normally pretty friendly people, but for some reason these folks were all business, didn't look our way, and if I tried to paddle that boat standing on the bow like that, I would probably end up swimming. Here's one of the fish traps that was down, and they'd lift the net periodically. You see one of the nets up there, and then go collect the fish out of them. These craft were junk rigged and were very seaworthy. They'd be gone for a week at a time, well out into the South Pacific. I guess the South China Sea at this point. But you would see them sailing up and down the river. Here's one of the larger junks. Women carrying things on these shoulder attachments, and they were heavy. They were 40 or 50 pounds, and they would be jogging along the beach. One of the things you found in every village was a nuc mam factory. They'd take very small fish, they'd cook them, and they'd seal them up in earthen jars where they essentially would ferment. I was under the impression for about a year, and they would use this fish sauce on everything. Consequently, most villages smelled of nuc mam, or fish sauce. You can see quite a bunch of fishing boats here. A little pig running around in this village. We were back in this village in 2006, and it had changed a bit, but not as much as you might think. Periodically, we were invited by the Vietnamese forces out for dinner in the best restaurant in the village, which was a thatched roof. The kitchen was inside, although preparation of the food was done outside on that table. There was a side of beef and chickens and ducks hung on a clothesline covered with flies, which explains why we had some gastrointestinal problems after eating in the village. Here we see Vietnamese forces going on, and the cattle were being driven down the road. This is Highway 1, and again you'll see some slides after the video's over showing a very good 4-lane highway in 2006. We were then beginning to see some buildings with more concrete walls and bricks. This is a fuel farm the Seabees put in for the airfield. The bladders were filled with aviation fuel, and the plans were for some regular tanks, which we see being placed here. Here's a dental clinic, and more fighting positions continually being improved and enlarged. They were drilling a well here, I'm not quite sure for what. To the north of the beach was a rocky area, and the original plan was to put a causeway out there or a dock so that they could land ships. They did some blasting to make a roadway down, and then the plan was abandoned and it was moved into the river north of us. It was better protected. I think it turned out the river was deep enough to do it. When we first got there, Sikorsky were the only helicopters that we saw. They had a great radial engine there. And toward the end of our deployment, the Hueys came in. Never got to ride in a Huey. I'm wondering if it was a smoother ride than the Sikorskys. They always felt to me like they were trying to rattle themselves apart. The Seabees then took over other chores. Here is a pad being laid down for the helicopter pad north of the runway. Quite a large pad. They had a lot of helicopters there eventually. And again, the SATS matting went down. They were also building camps for the Marines, a more permanent camp than what we had up to that point. Started out calling our camp Camp Bannister. It was renamed Camp Shields after Marvin Shields, a CB stat team member from MCB-11 who died in an attack, and one of the stat teams was quite a hero. That was our bathroom facilities. You had a nice view of the South China Sea. Here's now water tanks for our camp, so our water was treated. And we actually had indoor showers by that point. Tents are continually being improved and hardback made into a more permanent living facility. We actually had a Navy exchange. The dental office and the medical offices were next door to each other. As we got into fall, we started having rains, which became a real issue. I have never seen so much rain come down for so long. Everything that had leather ended up moldy. We also started picking up a lot more in the way of surf and winds. It did cool off a lot though, which was nice. It had been very warm. Our outhouse was now surrounded by netting. And once in a great while, we'd even have fresh meat, which was a real delight. Cooks did a great job. Considering the conditions they were working under, they did a spectacular job. Eventually we actually had some protective wire out in front of us. And it's a beer hall for the Seabees, a large circus tent. And you can see the wind was here probably doing 25 knots. And then the rains came, and the rains came, and the rains came. And it rained this way, I would guess, for about 6 weeks. Everything was wet. You'd go to bed tonight and the tent had leaked enough, you'd turn your cot over and dump the water out. If you were in a Jeep driving down the road and you saw a mud puddle, you could have the front tire disappear into the puddle. And so they brought in about 5 C-130s to transfer us to Okinawa. And there was not a lot of room for a C-130 on this airstrip. The wings were over well off the runway when they landed. This one we pushed back because the one in front of it was stuck for some reason and couldn't leave, and they have no way of backing up, so the Seabees pushed them back. Loaded them up, and they were off on the way back to the land of the big PX.